Well, good evening, everyone. And hello, good evening to our Levine community and all of our Levine friends across the Dallas area and across the country. I'm Tom Elieff, head of school. Welcome to Live Levine Update. I'm so excited to introduce our guest this evening. She is a sought-after speaker, a media contributor, a presenter to a full range of audiences, including medical, governmental, and parent groups. She has shared her expertise on CNN and the Washington Post, the New York Times, Forbes, and many other outlets. At one time, she was a clinical dietitian at Boston Children's Hospital. I just want to mention a couple of book titles that we'd love to share with you here. One is Fearless Feeding: How to Raise Healthy Eaters from High Chair to High School. Try New Food: Help Picky Eaters Taste, Eat, and Like New Foods. The Smart Mom's Guide to Healthy Snacking. And so with that, I want to welcome Jill. Jill, thanks for being with us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
That's great. Listen, Jill, I mentioned a book. One of the more fascinating facts you mentioned right at the outset of that Fearless Feeding book, and that it's estimated that we will feed our children, I love this, 28,000 meals by the time they enter college. Now that's a staggering to consider. But let's scoot back, because I want to start way back at the beginning of that journey, and talk about feeding and the issues related with feeding infants and toddlers. What should our approach as parents be? Why is it that we fall into this trap of frustration, or I think you called it in your book, silent dread, where we are giving up on feeding the right foods? What are we doing wrong, and how does that go wrong?
Well, first, I just want to say we're not doing anything wrong intentionally. And, feeding kids is really hard. I've raised 4 kids of my own. What I try to make the case for in that book is that we kind of come into the realm of parenting our children and feeding them without a whole lot of education. And unfortunately, not a whole lot of support along the way. We take our kids, our infants, to the pediatrician frequently, and we get our checkups, but we don't get a whole lot of support around nutrition. We don't get a whole lot of information about what foods or how to feed our kids or what we should be expecting. And the reality is, there are preferred foods, but food is food. All of our kids have to eat. I propose that feeding our children, that interaction that we have with them day to day around food, might be even more important than the food itself. Mm-hmm. And then when you think of child development, and you think about cognitive development and social emotional development, food is a vehicle for mapping out a child's development in certain areas and how we connect. And so when I talk about nutrition, I'm thinking about food and nutrients, but I'm also thinking about how we are building our children's relationship with food, because that informs the relationship they have with themselves and their own bodies.
Well, look, Jill, you mentioned just now, the interaction and how important that is. And I know that you do discuss in one of your books about taking what you call a diplomatic approach to feeding your children. Could you explain what that diplomatic approach is, and what do you mean by fearless feeding?
Sure. So there are 4 known feeding styles that have been well studied in the literature. Diplomatic is sort of the gold standard. We all want to be moving towards a diplomatic style of feeding. And diplomatic feeding is really like you have a lot of structure around food and when it happens, mealtime, snack times. You also have boundaries around food. So if you're a diplomatic feeder, you're serving meals and snacks in a timely fashion. Your kids can predict them. They know sort of the system in the home, but you also have boundaries. The kids can't go into the kitchen and just carte blanche eat anything they want at any time of the day. And when we have boundaries and we have structure, and then we implement choice, which helps children establish their autonomy, that's considered diplomatic. And when we look at the scientific literature, diplomatic feeding lends itself to healthier kids who choose to eat healthier foods and who are more active. And so that's why I want all parents to be diplomatic, as opposed to some of the negative feeding styles, like being overly indulgent or being uninvolved with feeding, or just being too controlling about food and feeding. And that happens quite a bit in families across America. And when we look at how those feeding styles play out over time, they're not cultivating children who are autonomous, who eat and choose to eat a healthy blend of foods and participate in healthy lifestyle behaviors.
Well, I want you to pick up on that I'm going to take another word that we just used here as structure. Why is that important, and what do we mean by a good structure throughout the day for feeding?
Sure. So structure really just means what time is breakfast, what time is lunch, what time is dinner, what time are snacks. So timing is a big part of structure, but so is the location where children eat. Are they eating at a kitchen table? Are they eating at a dining room table, at a kitchen counter? Or is there eating all over the place, in their bedroom, in the car, in front of the TV? So the looser the structure, the harder it is for children to regulate their appetite and regulate their eating. And so having structure, and this doesn't have to be super rigid, but having a predictable flow and system with meals and snacks really helps children engage in that structure and really be able to self-regulate. And you're ahead of school. You know this to be true from a school system. Like, think about preschoolers who go to school. They have a structure, they have a system. They show up, they take off their backpacks, they hang it on the hook, they take off their shoes, they go to their desk, they have a routine. We want to do the same thing with nutrition and feeding our children. That routine builds security and predictability for them.
Well, that's great. I'm going to follow up another question in a moment. I just want to tell our parents that they certainly can pose questions. We'll take your questions. You can write them into the Q&A down below, and please feel free to do that at any time. And from time to time, we'll check and see if you've got a good question for us, and we'll certainly share that and share that with Jill. But Jill, I want to ask a question about the different kinds of foods. I mean, obviously, a lot of parents get frustrated that their children start to take toward, unhealthy or sweets or whatever it is. But you talk about a ratio between nutrient foods and what is it? Fun foods.
Fun food.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Sorry, get us off the hook a little bit here from all of our guilt here.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me say first, I think sweets and treats can be a fabulous part of a child's life. They can conjure up a lot of positive memories, and we can include them in our kids' lives without letting them take over and ruining their whole diet. So I just want to put that out there. There is room for sweets and treats. When I was in private practice, I came up with the 90-10 rule because I recognized that a lot of families were struggling with how much sweets and treats can my kids have? And while this is very nuanced and is going to be individualized for every family, I came up with this sort of ratio because the World Health Organization has recommendations about sweets and treats. The USDA does, all the governmental agencies who are telling us how much sugar we can have and how much we shouldn't be eating. So the 90-10 rule goes like this: 90% of what kids are eating on a day-to-day basis should be from nutrient-rich foods in their diet. So things that are like fruits and vegetables and protein sources and dairy products or fortified non-dairy products, whole grains most of the time, healthy fats. Those are the foods that we want to see taking the lion's share of our children's diet. So 90%.
I see.
That leaves us with 10%, which can come from what I call fun foods, sweets and treats, ultra processed foods that aren't providing a lot of nutrients, aren't giving a lot of nutrition, but might be giving a child a lot of enjoyment and a lot of satisfaction, or allowing them to engage in food in a social way. So 10% really shakes down to about 1 or 2 sweets or treats on average per day. So we all know we're not robots. We don't live a predictable day every day. Some days might have a lot of sweets and treats, particularly if there are parties or celebrations. Other days might not have any. So each family has the ability to figure out their own balance, but it gives you sort of a concrete way to think about how many sweets or treats can happen in a child's life. So 10% is not going to break the bank. It's not going to ruin your child's health. It's not going to, it allows them to have an enjoyable experience with sweets, but again, keeps nutrient-rich foods front and center in their diet.
Could you tell us a little bit more specifically about the core nutrients for, let's just keep it for a moment. I'll move up to the elementary in a second, but the infants and toddlers and the younger children.
Sure.
What are the core nutrients that they need to have?
So kids need 40 nutrients a day, but as they grow, those the importance of each nutrient changes. When I think about infants and toddlers, and when I speak with parents, there's a lot of growth happening, particularly in the infant stage, and it's a calorie demanding growth. Babies are small, so it's all proportionate, right? So babies are never going to eat as many calories as we need to be eating as adults or older, bigger children. But babies have a diet, particularly in the first 6 months of life, that's half of the calories from fat. So fat is a really important component of the baby diet because the brain requires fat to be built. It also requires iron and zinc and choline and B12 and a bunch of other nutrients. The focus in infancy is really the brain and that cognitive development. So the brain structure doesn't get built unless there's adequate iron in the diet, adequate protein, adequate zinc. Enough fat in the diet to not only help the baby's body grow and meet those energy demands, but also lay the blueprint for message transmission in the brain. When we move into toddlerhood, we're still talking about the same nutrients, but growth slows down quite a bit in toddlerhood and picky eating sets in. And so we have this conundrum, if you will, where we don't have high energy needs like we did in the infant stage. We also don't have a child that is willing to eat anything we put in front of them. We have an opinionated child, and this is where the developmental stuff comes into play, because they're completely different people than they were as infants. And so when we talk about nutrition, we are still looking at a very nutrient dense diet because the brain is still in high development mode. And we are also wanting a nutrient rich diet, calcium, vitamin D, those brain nutrients I talked about. We want the diet to be really rich in nutrients also because eating tapers off, but their bellies are still tiny and they're not eating huge meals. So when they are eating the foods that they're eating, they take up they take up real estate quickly in the tummy. So we want to make sure that the foods that they are eating are rich in nutrients so that they meet their needs for growth as well.
Now, I want to ask, this is one about introducing, you talk a lot about the importance of a variety of foods. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that this is a big source of tension in a lot of households, and with kids being very picky or singling out only 1 or 2 things, or like a mom told me today, hey, tonight, can you ask Jill, what do I do about my son who's a 2-year-old, and he won't eat anything unless it's a snack, and there was a question just came in that's related to that. I want to share it with you. It's that, you were talking about the diplomatic style, but how would you suggest we move toward or transition toward a diplomatic style if we had been doing, sort of an anything goes, had a anything goes approach first?
Yeah.
I mean, what would you suggest we do?
I think the first step, if you're moving towards diplomatic feeding, is to pick out times for your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and try to stick to those times within a half hour on each side. And then, depending on the age of your child, figure out what times your snacks are going to be and really sort of formalize those, make them really sort of an event of the day. We go to the kitchen, we sit at the counter, that's where we eat. And so sort of really building a lot of structure around that will help you take those first steps to becoming diplomatic. In terms of the parent who asked the question about the 2-year-old who only wants to eat snacks, this is particularly important to do when children are toddlers, because those habits by the time they're 5, the habits are really kind of established, and it doesn't mean that you can't change them. It just becomes harder to change them. So toddlers are perfect for routine. They love routine. Developmentally, they like to be in charge. So if you set up a routine of, we go to the counter, we get in our chair, we have our snack at 3 o'clock, and then you go down for a nap or whatever your schedule is. If you get that sort of routine, your child will be able to anticipate it for you. And that toddler will climb into his chair and be ready for snack time at 3 o'clock. You can start to teach them to look at the clock and see the timing and know that it's time. And this is what we do at 3. So my advice for the mom of the 2-year-old is to really start to try to not have willy-nilly snacks all day, because in toddlers especially, it ruins their appetite. And so then when you do bring them to the table for a meal, they're not hungry because they've had snacks all day long. And so it's really important to create space, time between meals and snacks, so that young children especially can build up an appetite. So when they do come to the table, when it is mealtime or snack time, they're hungry.
No, I want to also follow up with a question. This is kind of pushing up to the 6-year-old child now, very similar. And this one asks, what's your suggestions for opening up a 6-year-old child that is an extremely picky eater to considering a broader selection of food options?
Yeah. So I have a small book on my website, The Nourished Child, about extreme picky eating. I worked a lot with kids in my private practice with extreme picky eating. When typical picky eating is pretty expected between the ages of 2 and 6 years of age. Children tend to start growing out of their picky eating stage around 4, and it tends to get better. When you have a child who is 6 or older and it's not getting better, that child probably or may have some underlying thing going on. We'll use the word thing. It could be a medical thing. It could be a sensory thing. It could be a behavioral thing that's happening. Usually when children are older, there's something underpinning that extreme picky eating. And some of the worst things we can do with children who are extremely picky is put a lot of pressure on them to try new food, to taste something. Children who are extremely picky need to build self-confidence to try new foods. And a lot of them need food therapy or feeding therapy, where you're really systematically introducing very small amounts of food in a non-pressurized environment so that they can build confidence and try those foods. Of course, if there's a medical condition underlying, like, for example, gastroesophageal reflux or esophageal esophagitis, these things can really be barriers to children ever even putting anything in their mouth, with the best therapy of all. So I always encourage parents to talk with their doctors and really do a medical evaluation and try to get a sense as to, is this coming from a medical situation, or is my child just really sensitive to the characteristics of food, like texture, temperature, smell? Because there are children that have real sensitivities to food and it's a complete turnoff. And so they need to sort of become desensitized to those characteristics through therapy.
So a couple of questions here I want to ask you. You made me think of that just by your answer there toward the end, which is a couple of things. Like let's say you're with me in the grocery store, and all right, I know the price is a consideration, but on the one hand, what is the difference between, or should we be concerned about organic versus inorganic foods, or the non-organic foods, I mean? And another one about allergens, and how do we prepare our children the best we can to sort of stave off those allergies later on.
Yeah. So, the inorganic organic conversation is really a conversation of finances. If you, in young babies, the scientific research shows us that if you can go organic, I don't want to make anybody feel bad if they can't purchase organic foods. And so I want to sort of frame this in the sense of, we have research that shows in babies who are not eating organic foods, higher levels of pesticides in their urine. So, but we don't have any research that says that's particularly bad for them. It just shows that there's pesticides in their urine. So, my sense is, if you can, keep the diet sort of as clean as possible, in the sense of, if you can keep a very young child's diet organic, if you can keep them away from artificial food colorings, if you can keep them away from a lot of preservatives and artificial things in their foods, great. But there's a lot of kids out there that are eating all of those foods and they are fine and perfectly doing okay. And so the organic inorganic conversation is really a personal decision for families. I don't particularly have a stance. I try to support families where they're at, in terms of their own preferences and what way they want to go. I don't want any family to feel badly about feeding their child whatever they choose to feed their child. So, so the food allergy conversation, we actually know a lot about food allergies, and that whole world has sort of turned. All the research lately has really reversed what we used to know about food allergies. It used to be that, even when my kids were younger, avoid the food allergen if you want to prevent it. Now we know, the latest scientific research says, no, don't do that. Introduce the food allergens by a year of age to prime the immune system so that it doesn't react to those foods. So the current recommendations, if you have a baby under the age of 1, the recommendations are to introduce all 8 or 9 allergens now before
milk
they
and
1.
eggs and
Milk, eggs,
tree
soy,
nuts, and
wheat, tree nuts, peanuts, all of that, fish,
soybeans and things.
shellfish, all of those things before a year.
Well, that's, I mean, and that is supposed to inoculate, or it has a way of preparing the body, I imagine, to accept them.
Yes, it does. And the research has basically shown that when children are introduced before a year, they have far less reaction to these allergens when they eat them later. Yeah, it's been a true reversal. It's been a true reversal in the science.
Amazing. Hey, listen, I want to ask a kind of daily management structure question.
Sure.
This is coming in from a parent now, just now as well, who says, look, like, she's a working parent, and she's not home until after 5 or 6. Now, how do you really manage, what your child's going to eat? Of course, they'd be at school, let's say, in the aftercare or whatever it might be. But if you're not there to oversee these elements of the day, what do you suggest that these working parents do?
Well, I think, when your children are at school, you're relying on the school to provide balanced meals, or you're packing those for your child yourself. When it comes to, breakfast and snacks, I'm assuming parents are making breakfast in the morning before the
Right.
kids go off to school.
Yes.
And again, these meals don't have to be fancy. You can do ready to eat cereal, or you can do a cooked oatmeal or grits. You can do a glass of milk, raisins, toast with peanut butter. I mean, it does not have to be fancy for breakfast. And for dinner, the same thing. I think our society today leads us parents to believe that we have to cook these amazing meals every night of the week. And you know what? Kids actually like plain food, and they like it to be uncomplicated and recognizable. And so you don't have to have fancy meals. You can have breakfast for dinner. You can have soup and a sandwich for dinner. Again, when you think about nutrition, I prefer families to think about food in the food groups, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, dairy products, and trying to get a food group from each of those categories into the meal. And so when you think about food and food groups, a sandwich has bread and peanut butter, there's your whole grain, and there's your protein. A glass of milk is your dairy, and a piece of fruit. Does not have to be complicated.
Right.
But I get you. I mean, I was a working mom with 4 kids after school and had to come home and cook meals too. And I did a lot of pre-planning, a lot of crock pot meals. We did takeout once a week. I just tried to really think about the week in terms of what are my busiest, craziest days. Those would be the days I had like a crock pot meal or an Instapot meal or something fast, maybe a takeout meal. And then the days I had more time and I wasn't running around after school, I tried to cook quick meals, simple, quick meals, grilling chicken, or whatever your family likes. Pasta was always one night a week at my house.
That's great. I want to ask a question. Here's another one from a parent. What are your recommendations on avoiding soy-based foods or snacks, especially for young girls, because they are estrogen producing?
Yeah. Well, the research is not conclusive on that. I know there's a lot of media talk about that, but the research on soy is protective, if anything, for girls and for boys, because there's also a rumor going around that boys will become feminized if they eat soy. Those are not true, and have not been proven in the literature, in the scientific literature. And kids in Asia are eating soy tons, a lot of times, and they don't have the rates of chronic disease and cancer like we do here. So soy is part of a balanced diet. Again, it falls in the protein or legume category, and it's just like every other thing. The best defense against ill effects of food is really trying to keep a balance of all kinds of different foods. The more variety, the more you dilute down the negative aspect of any one particular food.
So, Jill, I have a question here that might move us more toward, well, maybe this is a younger child, but maybe for all ages, because it's one about, is there really such a thing as particular foods that are good for the brain?
Well, I mean, there are nutrients that are good for the brain and foods that are full of those nutrients. Okay. For example, fatty fish like salmon, full of omega-3 fatty acids and DHA and EPA, all of which are good for the brain. So yes, there are foods that are good for the brain. If you're, I mean, there's blueberries have flavonoids. Those have been proven to be good for the brain. Nuts and olives and olive oil have all of those healthy fats that are good for the brain. Of course, meats, Beans are going to be rich in iron, and those are going to be great for the brain. So there are brain foods. I think I have an article on my website about the best brain foods for kids. I mean, again, it's not like you're just feeding these foods to your child and that's all you're doing. You're incorporating them into a diet that has a whole lot of different foods in it.
So now I'm going to switch the other side, going from brain foods to TV dinners now. What are your thoughts? This is coming in from a parent. Okay, what are your thoughts on takeout dinners a few nights a week? We're so busy, and that's usually the only way we get dinner on the table. At a decent time.
Yeah, I guess if that's what works for your family, you can certainly do that. And one of the things I would suggest is what I observe oftentimes when families might be doing takeout or going out to eat, that fruit gets forgotten or vegetables might get forgotten. So, if you're bringing home takeout, pull out some oranges, let your kids peel the clementines, or pull out some grapes and put them on the table, maybe some carrots or cucumber slices, something that's easy to just round out the meal. So it's showcasing all the different foods. Because one of the things that I hear all the time from parents is that their child won't eat vegetables, or their child only eats 3 different fruits. And I'll ask, well, how often does your child see all these other different vegetables? How often do you serve, mango and cantaloupe and all these fruits that you can offer? And oftentimes those foods are not making it to the table. And so I would encourage parents who are listening to try to, round out a meal with a fruit and a vegetable. I always had a rule for myself when my children were young, from babies on. I always put fruit on the table at every single meal. So breakfast and dinner, there was fruit. And because I figured if I can't get the vegetable on the table, or they're not going to eat the vegetable, at least they're getting similar nutrients from fruit. And most kids will eat fruit without a problem. And it rounds out the meal, and it provides fiber, and it's filling. So that's what I would do, I think, with takeout, is just try to round it out with some easy fruit addition, easy vegetable addition.
Now here's a if you can answer this one, I'm buying into your startup company here. Is it possible to host a birthday party without having to resort to soft drinks, cookies, and cake, and instead make it healthy and fun?
Wow. I think, probably easy to get rid of the soft drinks, I think. Thank goodness for sparkling flavored waters now, right? Bubbly. Thank goodness for bubbly. I'm not an affiliated brand, but the whole cake, the whole healthifying the birthday thing. I mean, can we talk about that?
Well, maybe we can answer it by saying that just don't go to more than one birthday party every 10 days. That's your ratio.
Yeah. Well, I just think birthday cake is such a part of childhood, and that should be part of it, and I think, if you find your child's going to a lot of birthday parties and a lot of celebratory events that are showcasing a lot of foods that you don't want to see your child eating, then I say make your home sort of more of a health haven, and let the outside world serve up all the sweets and treats. But don't have them at your house, because then you don't have to stress out about it if your child's eating outside of the home and getting these things outside of your home. Keep your house nice and healthy. And then that's what I did with my kids.
Great. Well, I'm going to
about the soccer game treats, because I wasn't packing sweets and treats in their lunches at school, and I wasn't serving them during the week.
Well, listen, I want to do a bit of an aside here by bringing on a testimony from one of our 8th graders. And Elieff, you can put that up in just a moment when I call for it. But I wanted to say to our audience that one of our 8th graders, Ella, she is in Israel now. The 8th graders landed in Israel this afternoon safely. and they're off on their 17-day journey in Israel before returning. 2 days ago, Ella agreed to, and her mother approved, that she would speak and give testimony to her experience entering middle school with a condition of body dysmorphia and how she overcame it. So I want, Yael, can you put up that video here?
Hi, I'm Ella, an 8th grader at Levine Academy, and I'm here to share my story about body dysmorphia and how I overcame it. Many teenagers lack self-confidence because they feel as if they're not good enough. And in my case, I saw other teenagers who I thought were perfect, and it lowered my self-esteem. I became more reserved, mainly with my clothing choices and how I presented myself. I think the main thing that contributed to my body dysmorphia was social media. I saw people on my phone, usually with filters, and I felt as though they were perfect. And after a couple months, I spoke to my parents and a family friend who shared her struggles when she was a teenager. It relieved me to know that I'm not the only one. After she spoke to me, I started to wear whatever I wanted. I became more confident. And I also watched The Social Dilemma, and I realized that most of the stuff we see on social media is actually fake. Also, I've always been a foodie, and I grew up eating healthy, so I wasn't going to give up food. I'm very lucky that I ended my body dysmorphia before it became more serious, such as an eating disorder. Today, I am confident and happy with who I am. I hope I encourage you to talk to your children about this important topic and help them overcome their struggles. It will make me happy to know that I've changed at least one mindset and that I've done a mitzvah. Thank you for listening.
Well, we sure thank Ella and her mother for approving that, and Ella and her courage in sharing that with us. Jill, I just want to hear your thoughts on your takeaway from that.
Well, what a brave young woman, number one, to be able to identify what she was feeling and put a name to it and connect it to social media, which I think is a huge challenge right now for our children. And, you know, body dysmorphia, bigorexia, which is a new thing on the block, eating disorders, anorexia, binge eating disorder, all of these things are rooted in body image challenges and self-esteem challenges. And, you know, after the pandemic, we are seeing, and I mentioned this to you earlier, Tom, you know, hospitalizations for eating disorders have gone through the roof, higher than ever, record numbers. We have research that is telling us that half of all girls between the ages of 9 and 14 want to be thinner, and 75% of boys want to be bigger and more muscular. And that's what bigorexia is. It's that desire to be muscular. I mean, and this is coming from 10, 11, 12-year-old boys who don't have the testosterone to even build muscles. But in their head, they think that they should look a certain way. And children are starting to do things in order to change their bodies. And it's heartbreaking to think about the fact that, you know, we have research of children between the ages of 3 and 5 that when they draw pictures of themselves, they draw pictures that do not relate at all to what they look like. And so this whole idea of body dissatisfaction and body image problems is a real crisis, and it's a building crisis. And parents really have to be aware of what their kids are doing when they're not around. They need to have some limitations on social media. And as your child gets older, you can't really just impose these things, right? You have to negotiate them. And really, you know, your student mentioned the filter factor. That's a real thing. Like almost everything that's out on social media is filtered some way, shape, or form, particularly advertisements, influencers, TikTok stars. all of these things are changing our kids' very impressionable brains.
Wow.
And because of their development, they're very vulnerable to these ideals.
Wow. Wow. It's just, it's a sad phenomenon, and something that, of course, all of us who work in middle schools and in high school need to address. Our counselors do, all of us do, because it can really, really affect them psychologically for a long time if they're not addressed. And I really appreciate in your books you make mention of Erik Erikson, and you bring the psychology of the phase of life into your comments about what is appropriate, at these different stages of a child's life. And I think it's a really, really well done to remind ourselves how connected, we are, our eating, our health, and of course, no question about it, our psychology, and I think it's a really good touch that you bring. If I can add, I'm going to have a couple more questions before I close out with my final question here.
Okay.
But because I'm going to pull them from the parents here. So these are real situational types. So one says here, like, I like this, I fall into the habit of using treats as an incentive. If you eat supper, you can have dessert. How bad is that? Or what is your comment about that type of approach?
That is an approach. That's a feeding practice called rewarding. And we have actually quite a bit of research on it. So scientists actually look at what happens to kids over time when they are incentivized to eat certain types of food, using oftentimes sweets. And what happens is we as parents think that, yeah, we got to win. We got our child to eat broccoli. Yay, us. But what happens in the child's mind is that, oh, broccoli must be awful. They have to give me something sugary to eat in order to get me to eat it. And actually, over time, what happens is the hierarchy of food in a child's mind changes. So we want them to rank vegetables on top of the pyramid as the most important food. But what happens is they put vegetables on the bottom and they rank sugary, sweet reward foods on top. So we change their perception by doing that. And over time, it gets really hard for us to get them to be motivated to eat vegetables without an incentive. And so it just, it doesn't work in the long run. It's one of those feeding practices that gives you a quick win, but down the road, you start to face problems with, why is my child obsessed with sweets? Well, because every night he got a treat because he ate his green beans. And now that's what he wants to have all the time. So we actually have a lot of research on that. And that's one of those negative feeding practices that lots of parents do it, and they do it with good intentions.
Right.
And I feel like my job is to spread the word about, here's what we know about the research when we do that. These actually have consequences that you might not see those consequences today, but 5 or 10 years down the road, you might be looking at a very different situation.
Well, that sounds very familiar to us in education. Of course, you might recall the book from Alfie Kohn several years ago called Punished by Rewards. And that's a real classroom instructional approach, to make sure that we're really teaching, to the spirit and to the inner inspiration of the child. And so that we are not giving external rewards for something that should be intrinsic, to the child.
Exactly. And just to let parents get off the hook a little bit, let me just say, pediatricians have been doing it for years. When the child gets a shot, the dentist does it when they clean your kids. I mean, it's not just parents. Our world rewards kids for their behavior with food. And we need to disconnect food from rewards, right? It doesn't drive intrinsic motivation.
That's right. So, I mean, how do alongside, I want to ask another one before we turn to a final question, but there's been some questions here about the mealtime, about strategy. One is asking about how do I wean my children away from bringing the iPad to the table when they are a family that actually is very strict about technology outside of the mealtime. So now they bring it in. This is your time to use it, but they're assuming that this is the wrong approach.
Right.
So how can they begin to sort of change things there and make mealtime a little bit more, I guess you might want to call it sanctimonious.
Yeah, ritual and sacred is what I like to say. Let me sell you on family meals. I will tell you, the research is compelling and it's indisputable on the effect and impact family meals have on children. So when you sit down with your child and you look at your child, doesn't matter what age they are, you look at your child, you talk to your child, you feed your child, you appreciate your child, you let your child teach you something. There is something magical that happens at meal times when parents are 100% engaged with their children. They're not fighting with their kids. They're not trying to get their kid to eat. They're not pressuring them. They're enjoying them and enjoying the food. There's some magic that happens there. And that kind of magic is emotional security, academic performance, social stability, like better interactions with friends, better ability to communicate, cohesiveness in the family. The research is compelling. So to me, if there's one thing you can do and start working on now is try to get one meal, one day, one meal each day where you sit together and look at your kids and eat together in a happy, positive environment. Now, you asked about electronics at the table, and this really is, these are distractions from eating and engaging in eating. And this is why it's problematic. And it's not just electronic toys, it's bringing books to the table, it's bringing toys to the table, having TV on while you're eating. The distractions disengage a child's mindfulness with eating. So they're not paying attention to the food they're eating, and they're not paying attention to their hunger and appetite cues. And when we disengage with our appetite cues, we lose sight of how much to eat, and we tend to overeat. And that's what the research tells us. When we're distracted, we're not really mindful about our eating. And I think we can all sort of extrapolate what it means to be disengaged with our appetite and not really paying attention to when we hit that point of satisfaction or fullness, which is the time to stop eating.
Well, Jill, I mean, this has been fantastic. I got another question here. I want to certainly share with my parents that your books are fantastic. They actually have some great recipes in them. I mean,
Yes.
if I knew about your salmon patties, when I was, raising my little girl over here, boy, I'd want to do that all over again. Add those banana muffins, and you got those pumpkin French toast recipes. That's awesome. You got a whole lot of them. Let me ask you this. I know in your book, you really set up a good context about today's world and how, things are actually, even though we live in a world of numerous choices and perhaps more affluence, and but it's much more, things are more complicated, to today, and whether it's just the two-income household, the digital age, distractedness, whether we look at the explosion of information and consumer choices, and of course, all the stuff out there on the internet, what advice that it could bad or good, or we don't even know what kind of advice it is. And, what I want to ask you is that you've been in this field for a long time, but what are the core ideals that we parents what should we prioritize, in our efforts to do right for our children and our families when it comes to living healthy lives?
Yeah. Well, I agree. It is, even when I wrote Fearless Feeding and it came out in 2013, almost 10 years later, I never thought I'd be saying this, but it's even more complicated now. We didn't have TikTok and all this social media. Facebook was just coming out. So, when I think about the priorities, my lens is nutrition and children. And so for me, of course, raising a healthy, physically healthy child does rely on a good battery of nutrient-rich foods every day, right? But that is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Connecting through feeding your child and having a trust-filled relationship with your child around food and feeding them is highly important, because to me, that leads to trust in other areas. When you can commune with your children around food and they trust you to not harass them about eating or punish them because they didn't eat something, when you build that trust, that extends into the difficult years, which are the teenage years, when your children will become much more independent and want to do their own thing. If they don't have that trust-filled connection with you, they aren't going to come to you with their problems. They're not going to sit down and want to spend time with you. And so these early years, yes, we're building healthy bodies, but we're also helping our children build a relationship with food and build a relationship with us. And to me, if you can use food to engage with your child, that's a double win. You're hitting the nutrition, but you're also hitting that emotional connection that's so important for children to be emotionally well, which I think, if we look at the next 10 decades, and I think about, I'm writing my next book, and it's all about raising, using 8 different pillars of wellness and being size sensitive to children. That the next 10 years is really going to be about the combination of physical health and emotional wellness. We cannot have one without the other. And the social media and the eating disorders and the body dissatisfaction and the mental health concerns that our children have now really elevate this idea that we need to be just as conscious about emotional wellness as we are about physical health.
Dr. Jill Castle, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been fascinating. It's been very important information. I think, and I'll say this honestly, as an educator here, an aspect of growing children, an aspect of education in our school lives that often we shortchange in what we should be working on in partnering with our parents and helping these children. Very, very important topics. And I really thank you for spending time with us on Live Living Update, and my best to you and your family. And I can't wait for your next book to come out.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Our pleasure as well. And to everybody out, the audience, thanks for joining us tonight for Live Living Update. You guys have a great night and a great week ahead. Good night now.